The primary onus of the endeavor we are discussing here lies on the scientific community. Research is a public funded enterprise. Scientists and research scholars are thus expected to be frontrunners in communicating science, ensuring public benefit from it, and educating the masses about why they should care about science. However, the real picture suggests otherwise. Scientific research generally tends to remain constrained within academic circles. But on a brighter note, there are some scientists who manage to break this barrier and rather beautifully by writing about their field of research in books and articles, through public lectures, and other avenues. Professor Lee Dugatkin from the Department of Biology at the University of Louisville has been setting an example while making some strides in this direction. Professor Dugatkin is a behavioral ecologist and a historian of science. His research interest lies in the evolution of social behavior. Over the years, Professor Dugatkin has delivered talks about his research at more than 100 universities worldwide and is the author of 150 plus articles and numerous books on evolution and behavior. He is a frequent contributor to Scientific American, Psychology Today, and The New Scientist. Our next segment is a small excerpt from one of his talks that he has kindly granted us the permission to use as part of our launch event. This excerpt is an introduction to Professor Dugatkin's book, How to Tame a Fox and Build a Dog. The book is the story of the most astonishing breeding experiment ever conducted that attempted to recreate and witness the first ever domestication process in real time, wolves to dogs. The book has gained huge popularity due to its simplistic approach in explaining the science of an evolutionary process, which changed the course of human evolution and redefined the boundaries between animals and humans thousands of years ago.
Hi, I'm Lee Dugatkin, and I just want to take a moment to introduce myself and to say that I'm thrilled to be part of the Cogito 137 YouTube launch, and I thank Arnika and the whole team for inviting me to be part of this. In a moment, you will hear me talk about a 60-year-long ongoing experiment involving the domestication of silver foxes. I had the opportunity to visit Novosibirsk, Siberia, where this experiment is going on twice, once in the winter of 2012 and once in the winter of 2014. It was minus 40 degrees out, but beautiful. And I had a chance to interact with Ludmila, the entire team of researchers involved in the experiment, and the incredible domesticated foxes themselves. These trips were transformational for me, perhaps more important than any trips I've taken in my life. And as you listen to the talk, I think you will see why. Thanks and enjoy.
So I'm going to start with a question. Right? Suppose that you could build the perfect dog. What would be the key ingredients in your recipe? Well, you definitely want cute, right? Maybe something with floppy ears and a curly tail that wags in anticipation whenever you're around. You'd want smart, you'd want loyal, and you definitely want unconditional love. The thing is that you do not need to build this animal, because for the last 60 years, a dedicated team of Russian geneticists in Siberia have been building it for you. The perfect dog. Except, as you might guess from the title of today's talk, it's not a dog at all. It's a fox, a domesticated fox. They built this in the minus 40-degree winters of Siberia, but more importantly, they built it in the blink of an eye in terms of evolutionary time, 100th of the time that it took our ancestors to domesticate wolves into dogs. So I'm going to tell you about cutting-edge work on this process of domestication, which is not something only of interest to biologists. Because if you think about it, when our ancestors began domesticating plants and animals, we dramatically changed our own evolutionary history. We would be very, very different if we had not done that. And this experiment that we're going to talk about is the gold standard for understanding how domestication comes about. So I'm going to try and give you an overview of what they've been doing and why it's important. 60 years. The experiment starts with this fellow, Dmitry Belayev. And Belayev's hypothesis went like this. The one thing that our ancestors always needed in whatever species they were trying to domesticate was an animal that would not try and bite their heads off. And so he hypothesized that the earliest stages of all animal domestication events involved our ancestors choosing the calmest, tamest, friendliest towards human animals. He further hypothesized that somehow, and he really didn't know how, but somehow all of those other characteristics in the domestication syndrome, longer reproductive periods, juvenilized facial features, all of that was somehow genetically connected to choosing animals based on how friendly they were towards humans. So he decided he would test these ideas in foxes. And the experiment he envisioned was very basic at its core. He imagined testing hundreds of foxes and choosing the calmest ones, the ones that are most friendly towards humans, preferentially breeding them. Then when their pups grow up, test them. Preferentially choose the ones that are friendliest towards humans. Do this generation after generation after generation. Foxes breed once a year, so essentially 1 year equals 1 generation. He would do this every generation, and he would see, first of all, was he in fact getting inherently calmer, friendlier to human animals, and strictly choosing them based on how friendly they were, did he also begin to see the emergence of other traits in the domestication syndrome? Right? Did they start showing lower stress hormone levels or other characteristics of the domestication syndrome? This is my friend and colleague and co-author, Ludmila Trut. Ludmila recently turned 85 years old, and every day, including today, for the last 60 years, she has led what's come to be known as the Silver Fox Domestication. And so what Ludmila would do every evening is that on the other side of this house, there's a little bench. And she would sit out there reading a book. And like you might with your dog, Pushinka would be lying by her side, and Ludmila would be reading and petting Pushinka. And every evening around 7 p.m. or so, there was a guard that would come around the fox farm just to make sure everything was okay. And they had hired a new guard that nobody knew. And this guard, on the night of July 15th, was approaching Ludmila and Pushinka in a sort of brisk way that maybe you might interpret as slightly aggressive. And Ludmila looked down at Pushinka and she could not believe what was happening. Pushinka had bolted up, charged towards the night watch person, and began barking at them exactly the way that a guard dog would, and exactly like no fox in the history of the experiment had ever barked. And Ludmila's first thought was, Pushinka's protecting me. But then she stopped and said, wait a minute. I know better than most how dangerous it is to fall into that trap, to think that animals are behaving the way we would in that situation. But then something else happened, which was that Ludmila went over to the watch person and began talking to them in a very calm, serene way. And when Pushinka saw that, she stopped barking, walked back over to the bench, lay down, and waited for Ludmila to come back and start reading. Is it possible Pushinka wasn't protecting Ludmila? Of course it's possible. But what Ludmila wanted to know was just how far down the path of domestication these animals had come, and Pushinka told her that. And the reproductive season of the elite domesticated animals was slightly longer, another trait in the domestication syndrome. In the early 80s, something remarkable happened. In about 84, a handful, maybe 4 or 5, of the elite domesticated foxes were ready to breed twice in a year. Not only in the typical January, February time, but a second time in September. Absolutely unheard of ever in foxes. but typical for domesticated animals. There are all these changes that have happened with domesticated foxes. Not only they're calmer, but all the morphological changes we talked about, the floppy ears, the curly tails, and so on. The first question was, at a molecular genetic level, are the genetic changes associated with that, are they kind of spread all over the genome of the foxes, or are they localized in sort of hotspots of genetic change associated with domestication? What they found was many, not all, but many of the changes in their domesticated foxes could be localized to one chromosome, Fox chromosome number 12. That's sort of interesting, right? It's not spread all over the genome. It's in a hotspot or in one of a couple of hotspots. More interesting was that at the same time they were asking that question, a group of people were asking the same exact question in dogs. So dogs have more chromosomes than foxes, but Fox chromosome number 12 is essentially spread across, bits of it are spread across 3 dog chromosomes. For anyone who's a biologist, these are homologous chromosomes. But basically, Fox chromosome 12 is divided up into bits of it onto 3 dog chromosomes. Lo and behold, one of those 3 dog chromosomes, again, is a hotspot for domestication, changes associated with domestication. So even deep down at the molecular genetic level, it looks like they're mimicking the process that happened with wolves to dogs.